All right, I'd like to welcome you to our discussion on limited dual agency here in Washington State. I am One Realty's designated broker, Brian Gass. Thanks for joining us. Now, on January 1st, some major changes went into effect related to the real estate agency law here in Washington. In fact, it's the biggest change to the law in its 26-year history. Now, intended to increase transparency and consumer protections, there are 4 areas of the law that are affected. There's the creation of the Broker Services Agreements, changes to dual agency, duties owed by brokers were expanded, and the real estate brokerage in Washington pamphlet was updated. Now, we also have additional information and videos for each of the 4 areas that are affected by the change at WashingtonAgencyLaw.com. We're going to start with what dual agency is, then we will go over the general duties that every agent or broker is charged with carrying out when representing a client. We will talk about limited dual agency, when it's allowed and under what circumstances. We will go over the specific duties that a limited dual agent is charged with, and I'll list some pros and cons of allowing limited dual agency for your agent. And then finally, we're going to try and give you an idea of what to do when it comes time for you to decide if you want to allow your agent to be a limited dual agent on your behalf. I'm guessing that when people hear the term dual agent, they might envision something like this. Maybe in spy movies, but not in real estate. A dual agent is a real estate agent who represents both the seller and the buyer in a transaction. Now, a limited dual agent is essentially the same thing, except for the name's been changed to better reflect the agent's limited ability to serve both principals at the same level if they were separate. Now, we'll explain why they are limited in a moment. First, take a look at real estate agency law in Washington. When an agent is working with a principal, there are certain duties the agent is charged with: loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality. Don't disclose any confidential information from or about your principal. You want to advise the principal to seek expert advice on matters relating to the transaction that are beyond the broker's expertise. There are specific duties that maybe a buyer's agent might have, such as when they're finding properties in the MLS for sale by owners, negotiate on issues that come up like price, advise on contingencies like inspection, recommending different contractors, will naturally be limited in their representation. Because of this, the state of Washington requires written consent to allow the agent limited dual agency representation. Now, this should happen when you list your home or first sign a brokerage services agreement and prior to any purchase and sale contracts. There are 2 situations where limited dual agency happens. All right, the first situation is the most obvious one, where one single agent represents both the buyer and the seller in a transaction. In this case, the brokers who supervise the agent will be considered a limited dual agent as well. Now, the other situation is when any 2 agents who are on opposite sides in the same transaction happen to be in the same brokerage. Now, of course, the individual agent who represents both parties, the designated or supervising brokers, are considered limited dual agents themselves and therefore subject to the same restrictions and disclosures. Those dual agency situations happen far more frequently at a brokerage, but the direct involvement of a supervising broker in a transaction is far less likely to happen. Now, the duties of a limited dual agent are very similar to a standard agent, except for one, and that is, quote, they may not advocate terms favorable to one principal to the detriment of the other principal, unquote. And that's a pretty big ask. You'll see in a second. Now, the duties of a limited dual agent aren't that much different than a standard agent. You got loyalty, you've got disclosure, seek advice for matters outside the agent's expertise, don't disclose information, make a good faith and continuous effort to find a property for the buyer, and find a buyer for the seller. Now, I'm hoping everyone can clearly see the inherent conflicts between what are naturally opposing interests of a buyer and a seller in a transaction. These opposing interests make it very difficult to really represent both parties. Focus on the statement, do not advocate terms favorable to one principal over the detriment of the other. Just think about discussions on price or inspection contingencies. An agent can't really talk about the price with both clients. The seller has one price, buyer has another. How do you square with that? That's just one of many, many conflicts that need to be resolved. Dual agency doesn't always have to be just one agent representing 2 parties in a transaction. It can also be when one agent represents multiple buyers who have the same profile when looking at properties for sale. Each person is owed the duties of a broker individually, but what happens if you look at them as a group, looking at the same property? They want to all make an offer. What do we recommend? Go to WashingtonAgencyLaw.com for more videos and information that we have on filling out the brokerage disclosure form, which everybody has to have, which includes the limited dual agency authorization. Second, there's no need to authorize limited dual agency right away. You don't have to do it in the beginning. You can leave it open. Such a time comes where it's going to be a great deal for you as a seller or a buyer. You can amend your brokerage services agreement to allow it later. You really have to weigh the pros and the cons on these. And for buyers, there's far more cons than there are pros. All right, well, here's a good segue. Pros and cons. Let's look at a couple of them. And I did grab this information from an article I saw that summarized the points well and just work for generalization. All right, so pros. The pros were one agent can streamline the transaction, cut down on the back and forth. Maybe. Listing agent might have more information on the property, but we'll see it's a con too. Reduced compensation. Buyer might have more negotiating power because there's two agents. Having the same brokerage, probably see streamline the transaction, same thing. All right, let's look at the cons though. Limited information. That's right, because there's going to be restrictions on the amount of information that can be shared. There's no guarantee the buyer pays less for the property due to a reduced compensation. The compensation is set by the seller in the listing agreement in most cases. Agent could be over incentivized to close the deal for no matter what. The agents we all know that each agent owes each of the principals a certain duties. Those duties conflict with the different interests that are involved. Seller doing open houses looking for a buyer. We all know only a buyer's agent can be expected to advise you, if you're a buyer, whether the listing price is reasonable, right? Because the listing agent is limited in their ability to advise you. And that same goes for negotiating issues like inspections. And who knows, maybe the seller has a better relationship with the agent and there's a conflict there as well. So it looks like the cons are going to far outweigh the pros. So what can you do? Well, for buyers, you should have a conversation with your agent on how they deal with multiple buyers and when they have multiple offers on the property. Check past sales of properties that you've looked at and see if maybe they were sold by your agent and there's a conflict somewhere. For sellers, it's pretty simple. Have the buyer be represented by somebody else, right? I mean, forfeiting confidentiality, loyalty, and limiting exposure on your property might not be worth it to save the money. I'll leave you with this. Dual agency isn't all bad. It isn't terrible every time anybody ever mentions it. There's times when dual agency can be the best choice, like when two parties know each other or they know the property, like family members, neighbors, or the parties have negotiated the issues of price and inspections already. They don't need the agent to do the back and the forth. Or if the property is a good fit and the issue of limited dual agency is fully disclosed prior to any contract negotiations, that's when you do it. You don't need to have it dropped on you with in the last minute or not know what's going on or who represents who and how people are getting paid. So that's the whole idea. That's going to wrap it up for our discussion on limited dual agency. I hope you learned a lot in your buying and selling your real estate going forward here in Washington. For any questions that you might have or for more information on limited dual agency or the new brokerage services agreements or anything else related to real estate agency in Washington, go to WashingtonAgencyLaw.com. You can reach out to me direct at any of our social media or by phone or by email. Until next time, remember that there are many asset classes that you can put your money in, but only one of them that you will call home.